Welcome to The Explainer. So, if you've ever finished reading a piece of short fiction, set the book down and just stared at the wall because you were feeling this profound emotion you couldn't quite put into words. Well, you actually have Anton Chekhov to thank for that. Today, drawing on the really fascinating scholarship of Charles May, we're going to explore exactly how Chekhov radically transformed the modern short story. We're unpacking the mechanics of how the genre evolved from these heavily plotted, neatly tied-up tales into profound, realistic slices of life. Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to look at fiction before the modern short story, explore Chekhov's lyrical slice of life, unpack Hemingway's famous iceberg theory, see how hard facts turn into metaphors, and finally, wrap up with a legacy of the unsaid. All right, Section 1, Before the Modern Short Story, the Old Way of Fiction. To really appreciate this revolution, we gotta look at where we started. Historically, short fiction moved through some very distinct stylistic shifts. Back in the Renaissance, you had the humanizing of the allegorical romance. You see this best in the novellas of Boccaccio. Then, moving into the 19th century, writers like Edgar Allan Poe started psychologizing the supernatural legend, but it really wasn't until the 20th century that we get to Chekhov, who completely changed the game by introducing the lyricizing of the slice-of-life story. Think about the old masters for a second. Before Chekhov came along, short stories relied heavily on explicit plotting and artifice. They operated on very specific, almost rigid frameworks. Poe, for instance, leaned heavily on obsessive narrators trapped in these subjective, hallucinatory worlds. Then you have writers like O. Henry, who built narratives entirely around neatly calculated, preconceived ironic endings. Basically, everything had to have a snap, a twist, or some huge supernatural shock to justify its existence. But what happens when you strip all of that heavy plotting away? That brings us to Section 2, Chekhov's lyrical slice of life, the paradigm shift. Notice the stark contrast here. We've got the traditional plot-driven tale on one side and Chekhov's seemingly storyless approach on the other. Critics at the time were, frankly, completely puzzled by this. They literally called his work artless and complained that it didn't have enough plot to fill a nutshell. But you know what? That was the absolute genius of it. Chekhov shifted the focus entirely away from heavy events and explicit details and moved it right onto tone, mood, and omission. So how did he actually do this? Well, Chekhov pulled us this brilliant balancing act where he united public realism with private lyricism. In plain English, that means he took the prosaic, hard outlines of everyday events, just the ordinary stuff people do in public, and he infused them with this deep, internal poetic intensity. He essentially proved a massive point. You do not need a ghost or a murder to create mystery. Everyday human desire, that's mysterious enough. And by paring down the narrative like that, the modern short story was born. It's all about brevity and economy. By focusing intensely on a unified tone, rather than a sprawling sequence of random events, the author leaves deliberate gaps. This creates a really unique union of idea and structure, giving the story an incredibly tight aesthetic unity. And most importantly, and this is a big one, it demands an active reader. It requires us to step up and interpret what isn't being explicitly handed to us on a silver platter. Moving right along to Section 3, Hemingway and the iceberg theory, the mechanics of the unsaid. Let's look at the next generation. Ernest Hemingway, who was heavily influenced by his time as a journalist, absorbed these Chekhovian lessons and totally formalized them into what we now know as the iceberg theory or the theory of omission. This is a minimalist writing style where the surface elements of the story are super clear and direct, but the actual underlying themes, they're never explicitly discussed. Hemingway actually said it best himself. The dignity of movement of an iceberg is due to only 1/8 of it being above water. The crucial takeaway here is that only a tiny fraction of the story is visible. The vast majority of it is underwater. If you as the writer truly know what you are writing about, you can just omit things. The reader is still going to feel them. Omitting what you know actually gives your story incredible weight and gravitas. A perfect example of this in action is Hemingway's story Big Two-Hearted River. The surface details are incredibly simple, almost boringly so. A young guy named Nick Adams goes on a fishing trip. That's it. That's the 1/8 above water. But the unseen bulk of that iceberg, Nick is a returning soldier. His intense, almost obsessive focus on the physical, step-by-step act of fishing is completely masking a deep, unsaid internal trauma from his war experience. Which leads us perfectly into Section 4, turning hard facts into metaphors, the poetic and prosaic. Consider another Hemingway classic, Hills Like White Elephants. Look at the hard facts of the setting.
A couple is sitting at a station, literally trapped between two railroad tracks running in opposite directions. On one side, the landscape is green and alive. On the other, it's brown and completely dead. They have a 35-minute wait for their train, but if you read the story out loud, the dialogue only takes about 10 minutes. These are not just random, throwaway details for the sake of realism.
What Hemingway is doing here is using these specific spatial and temporal constraints metonymically. Basically, he's using these associated physical objects to stand in for a massive, inescapable conflict happening between the couple. Because there's literally more silence than speech during those 35 minutes, the physical objects around them, the tracks, the barren landscape, they have to take on the burden of conveying the story's true meaning. He is literally transforming mere matter into meaningful metaphor.
And this just brilliantly illustrates the whole shift in the genre we've been talking about. In the old romance tales, you had unreal characters facing supernatural mysteries, right? Like someone confronting a ghost in a haunted house. But in modern realism, you have fully mimetic characters, meaning they imitate real everyday people, facing the unsayable, unnameable disruptions of ordinary life. The mystery is no longer ghosts. It's the unsolvable nature of our own lives.
Let's wrap things up with Section 5, The Legacy of the Unsaid, Raymond Carver and Beyond.
Raymond Carver absolutely carried this legacy into the late 20th century. In his story Why Don't You Dance?, a man has taken all his bedroom furniture and arranged it out on his front lawn exactly as it was inside his house. Carver never explicitly stops to tell us, hey, this guy's agonizing over a shattered marriage. He doesn't have to. The bizarre external setup of a nightstand and a lamp for his side of the bed and her side of the bed out on the grass immediately communicates that internal devastation without a single word of exposition. Or consider Carver's story Errand, which is actually a direct tribute to Chekhov's final moments. Carver researched the real, historical event of Chekhov's death and noted this exact sequence. The doctor knows the end is near, so he orders champagne. Chekhov takes a drink, passes away, the cork troughs to the floor, and later, a young boy simply picks it up. This exact sequence of mundane, hard facts builds into this incredibly poignant metaphor. Because think about it. The boy closing his hand around the cork means absolutely nothing literally, but metaphorically, it tells us that even in the profound, heavy presence of death, mundane life just simply continues. A single, trivial object suddenly resonates with the weight of an entire lived experience.
So, what are we taking away from this explainer today? The modern short story, born from Chekhov and refined by greats like Hemingway and Carver, endows commonplace things with immense power. It captures unsable human desires not by explaining them away, but by leaving deliberate, masterful gaps. It relies on you, the reader, to step in, fill those gaps, and feel the whole story beautifully unified by a single, pervasive emotion. These elements are exactly why the modern short story remains such a captivating, concentrated vehicle for exploring the human condition. It reflects the fragmented, complex reality of our own lives. So I'll leave you with this thought. Next time you read a short story, look closely at the surface. If the most powerful parts of a story are the things left unsaid, what is your favorite story hiding? Because remember, the real truth is almost always lurking just below the waterline.